confirm if you can see my screen, please?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. All right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the cloud. So by now, there's quite a few things that you should, in theory, have already looked at or at least be busy with. So by now, project 1 has been submitted and marking is underway. So as soon as we're done, we'll give you feedback and upload all of that onto Fundi. If you're sitting in class, you should have logged in with your student number and with some form of identification so we can identify who you are. Hopefully you're using your Northwest University Microsoft account. If you aren't, please just make sure you log in with your student number because that's what we're using to measure attendance. Then with regards to project 2, hopefully you've already started looking at what that looks like. Hopefully you've already started doing some of the API training. Hopefully you've looked at some Azure training or some cloud training. I'm hoping that you've also looked at the recording from last week so that you understand, what Prof. Kutsia was trying to show us from an API perspective. And essentially by now you should have at least started developing your API project. Hopefully by the end of today, you'll be able to create at least a local version of your database. Hopefully, you'll feel a little bit brave and try to do it on the cloud as well. But essentially, you should have already started with project 2. Make sure that you've source controlled your project if you have already started. Make sure that you update your project on GitHub, the one that you used for project 1, and that your project for your actual solution, your C# solution or your API solution is actually hosted on the GitHub repository. Make sure that repository is private and make sure that you keep a list of all references that you're using for this project. As well, your training should also be underway for API development, for cloud, those kinds of concepts. Hopefully what I'm going to be showing you today is going to resonate with a lot of you and it's going to help you better prepare for how this project should be executed. And hopefully then you'll get a better idea and better understanding of how all of this fits together. So just on that as well, we just want to note that there will be no project extension or project deadline extensions for this project either. None of the projects that are going to be executed or at least run this semester will have any extensions to them. So please take note of that and make sure that you account for that in your planning. All right, so the first thing that we ask generally when we're looking at the cloud or when we're trying to discuss cloud as a concept is we want to understand what is the cloud. And the cloud isn't necessarily anything that's quite new to us anymore. I think, time has passed where we're actually starting to understand a lot more about how the cloud fits into our daily lives. So the social media that you use, most of that is hosted on the cloud. The way that you access it is through the cloud. So, it's not really a new concept. I think it's stuff that we interact with quite a lot that we just don't realize that we're interacting with. But just because we interact with it and it's on the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that it just lives up there in the ether and there's nothing, kind of founding what the cloud actually is. So when we think about the cloud, it is pretty much something on someone else's computer. And the biggest challenge about using the cloud is that it is so easily accessible and it's built to be accessible that if it is not built securely or it is not used securely or used incorrectly, it can be very unsafe. So very easily you can, lose access to your documents if you're using cloud version of SharePoint, for instance. If you don't apply a proper source control, a proper access control, those kinds of contents or types of content that you keep on the cloud can be quite unsafe, which is why security is a very important part of what we do. Because we're working with the cloud, security is going to be a very important aspect to consider when you're working on these kinds of projects. And that's why next week, Prof. Kutsia will take us a little bit more in detail through security and how we apply that to make sure that our cloud implementations are kept secure and are kept safe. So when we look at the cloud space in South Africa, who are the main players? Microsoft definitely is one of the biggest ones. So they've got Microsoft Azure. Amazon has AWS, Google has Google Cloud Platform. Then there are a few other competitors like IBM Cloud, Huawei Cloud, and SAP Cloud. SAP is a little bit of a special case because SAP is actually an ERP system. So the way that SAP is implemented on the cloud platform is that it can actually be migrated onto Azure or AWS or so on and so forth as well. And that's actually changed the way that some of our cloud models look. Because traditionally we used to have an on-prem environment, which is essentially referring to all your documents, all your content, all your solutions, all your applications being hosted on a server that is on-premise, so something that you control. And essentially what happened is a lot of companies decided that they wanted to try this cloud expedition. They went through a bit of a migration exercise to move their content from on-prem to cloud, or to online, depending on the platform that you're using. But essentially what then happened was places like SAP or companies like SAP realized that when their clients are using Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform or any other cloud platform to store some of their applications, it's going to be a very tall ask to get SAP or get their clients to create or buy into another cloud solution that actually allows them to use the applications that essentially live within SAP. So what happened was SAP and Microsoft and a few other vendors had actually come to an agreement where you could actually host your SAP on Microsoft Azure as well. So it's quite cool to see how this has now started to form our hybrid environments where you can start looking at, multi-cloud tenancy. You can look at multiple kind of targets and geographies. You can also look at different approaches. So another hybrid scale is actually using a concatenation of on-prem and online configuration, essentially, in an organization, because migrating from on-prem to cloud is actually quite a costly exercise. So those are quite a few aspects of kind of where cloud is at the moment in industry. A lot of different companies use different clouds specifically because of the applications that they're trying to build and the platforms that they're using. So what that kind of means is if you're using something like Python or Node, Google Cloud is probably a really good place to host your stuff because it's a lot cheaper there. IBM as well, that works quite well with Node.js. Azure works quite well with Python, more so with C#. And when you start to look at the different database technologies, you'll find that Azure is a lot cheaper when you're using traditional databases. So, your normal SQL databases. As soon as you start moving into the NoSQL databases, it becomes very expensive. So each of these cloud platforms have kind of prioritized what their content is and essentially what resources they want on their platform and kind of, what they want to use as a marketing ploy to get more companies to actually buy into their products. And we'll go through that in a bit more detail. But before we do, when we talk about the cloud and we're talking about all these different applications and things that we can put into the cloud, what essentially does that mean? Like, what can we actually put into the cloud? And the answer is just about everything. If you are looking at stuff that you're doing locally on your computer that you want to essentially put into the cloud, and you can't think of a way that you would do so using some of the traditional resources like your app services, your API services, those kinds of things, you can actually create a virtual machine on the cloud. And you can host whatever processes you're running on your local machine on the virtual machine. And essentially it would work more or less the same way. If you're looking at hosting servers, there's multiple different server options that you can host. So you can host full-on computers, very much once again like the virtual machine. You can host database servers. There's a very wide range of servers and kind of options and configurations that you can host on the cloud as well. In terms of storage, depending on what you're trying to store, if it be files or if it's actually looking at quite a few other different concepts that relate to storage, that can also go into the cloud. Something that isn't really very widely adopted just yet is mobile applications that are hosted on platforms like Azure and Google Cloud and so on and so forth. I think Google Cloud has apps, which is quite cool. But in terms of Microsoft, they don't necessarily host their mobile applications on Azure. They rather use the Power Platform, which is something that I'll create a video about and actually put onto the YouTube channel for you to look at. But in essence, the different manufacturers or the different vendors in this industry are looking at different ways to expose their products in a way that makes sense. So even though they have 2 or 3 different platforms that allow you to access the cloud, essentially you're still using, the underlying principles of what they have to offer. Same with applications and databases. So depending on the platform that you're using, if we look at Microsoft, for instance, if you're looking at the Power Platform versus Azure, essentially, both platforms are hosted by Microsoft. Azure essentially allows you to create a normal SQL database, same way that you're used to doing with MySQL and SQL Server and so on and so forth. But what happens in Power Platform is they actually decentralize all of that and don't require you to have local copies on your environment. Essentially, what they do is they give you a space on the Dataverse, which is essentially a byproduct of Power Platform, that allows you to actually go insert all of your data there and use it the same way you would a SQL database. The trick is, though, that the database or the Dataverse that they have on Power Platform actually has the underlying technology of SQL Server backing it up. So in essence, they've taken, you know, technology that already exists, they've given it a different face and kind of presented that as a more user-friendly option, depending on, you know, which platform you want to work on. It also helps a lot with costing, which is something that we are very considerate of when we're thinking about cloud. So once again, cloud computing, I've mentioned here at the bottom that you get quite a few different types of cloud. So you get your private or your public cloud. Public cloud is essentially, you know, where your resources are on the same cloud as pretty much everybody else's. Because of GDPR and POPI and those kinds of acts and legislation policies, those kinds of things that have been implemented across the world, it has become quite a big concept that you know, your data that you're storing should not necessarily be stored the same place as everybody else's. So they actually have to create essentially a private cloud for you to host all of your stuff in. And that's becoming very apparent with things like ChatGPT. So not many people actually know this, or not many people really think of it. And we've seen it in the industry as well with people who are participating in hackathons. People are using ChatGPT for all sorts of things at the moment. For example, one of the use cases that we found was a company was actually trying to determine what their recruitment process should look like. So they take the CVs of the people who were applying for jobs, they chuck that into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT which position does ChatGPT think this person is suited for based on the CV and based on the job specifications that the company has provided. And that got quite difficult to manage because it happened in a European country, so they were governed by EU. And the company actually got into serious trouble because the problem is now you've actually just put all the applicants' personal information onto ChatGPT that can now be queried by other people. So things like that have made it really important for private cloud also to kind of flourish, because if you want to create your open AI model now, you'd want to do that in a private cloud where your data isn't necessarily mingling with other people's data. So essentially that's the core concepts around, you know, what we talk about when we're talking about cloud. Now, a lot of people, you know, would ask now, you know, which technology is the best to learn? Should I learn AWS? Should I learn Azure? Should I learn Google? And the answer is very subjective, because depending on the language that you're familiar with, depending on the language you want to code in, or, you know, what the project requires, that might actually sway the decision of which cloud platform to go for, just because of costing and because of rollout. Some solutions are slightly more scalable on other platforms than they are, you know, on one platform than they are on others. But essentially, between the major cloud providers that we have, you have pretty much the same resources that exist on the cloud. So for instance, if we're looking at app services or API services, which is essentially what you would need to use on Azure to be able to host your API, there is an equivalent on AWS and Google Cloud that allow you to do the same thing. So for instance, if we're looking at Azure Functions, there's AWS Lambda that exists on AWS, and there's Google Cloud Functions that exist on Google Cloud Platform. The same can be translated for databases, for data storage, so on and so forth. So the answer to which platform should you learn, or at least learn first, would be, you know, go with what you're comfortable with. In this case, in this module, we're going to be using Azure, so it's recommended that you do training on Azure. But if you choose to learn another cloud platform like AWS or Google Cloud, you'll see that the concepts are very easily translatable. Excuse me. So yeah, based on that, we found that people who at least specialize in one cloud platform are able to jump between the cloud platforms quite easily. So just because you're learning one doesn't mean you have to get stuck to one. It's quite easy to pick up other technologies, very similar to programming languages. If you understand the core principles of what goes into, you know, development and what standards you're supposed to apply, the only thing you really need to learn about a language is the syntax. So that's very applicable here in the cloud space as well. So the next question becomes, how do we interact with the cloud? And essentially this depends on, number one, the way that the resources were set up, but also number two, it's being built and designed to be very convenient. So depending on how you want to interact with it, that would essentially drive how you interact with it. So for instance, if you want to use a backend connection, you're most likely going to use an API. If you want to use a front-end connection, you're most likely going to have a front end that will allow you to interact with what you're working with. And 9 times out of 10, that will be through a cloud platform like the Azure portal, which we'll take a look at in a bit. But depending on the resources that you actually put down on Azure, that will determine how you actually interact with them. So for instance, let's take an app service, for example. An app service can be used to host your web application or your web API. And essentially, the commonality that lives between those two is the URL that you use, the endpoint. So if you use that endpoint, you're either going to get something like a Swagger or JSON output, or you could get a front end, because that would be what your website has been developed to use or to show. So in essence, the cloud can be interacted with in a multitude of ways, depending on what you're going to be putting onto the cloud. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about Azure, because Azure is going to be what we're using, and it's going to be important for you to understand how Azure is put together, because this is essentially what you need to replicate now when you start your cloud journey for Project 2 and Project 3. So when we're looking at Azure, we essentially want to start off with a subscription. Now, none of you at the moment, I don't think, have a subscription on Azure. You actually need to go create the subscription. The subscription that you're going to be creating is the student trial, where you get, I think it's $100 or $200 free for a few months that you then get to use. That subscription is essentially then going to be what encapsulates all of the work that you do throughout the semester. What happens next is underneath that subscription, you can create multiple resource groups. And these resource groups essentially group a bunch of your resources together in a logical fashion that you can then use to actually execute on some form of solution or problem statement. So there are multiple different ways to do this. The one is to actually group everything by project, and another one is to group everything by layers. So if you're working with, quite a few different apps and operating systems, because you've got OS disks, which essentially are linked up to virtual machines and so on and so forth, and you want to break them all out based on, what is your data portion of the project, what is your application part of the project, and which is your logic part of the project, you could break those out into resource groups. You would only really do something like that on a massive project. So if you've got a really big project that has a lot of different endpoints and a lot of different components or resources that are then used in Azure to actually put this together, that is when you would use a strategy like that. For the small projects that we're going to be building, you should only use one resource group. You should prefix it with RG and then whatever your name of the solution is going to be. So for in this case, you could say RG, we can say P2 API or something along those lines. If you want to make just one resource group that has all of your resources in for the semester, you can say Aug CMPG323. That is completely up to you. But then inside of that resource group, you actually have resources. So here you'll see you can have an app service, you can have an API service, you can have a SQL database, and you can have a SQL server. Essentially, in your instance, all of these will live in the same resource group, but this shows you that you can break it up all together. You cannot create a resource without a resource group, and you cannot create a resource group without a subscription. That is the hierarchy that you have to follow. There's also some best practices around the way that you name things in Azure. So I've popped that link into the slides. The slides are on Fundly, so that you can go take a look there and see what's cracking. Now, I want to pause there quickly before I go on to how Azure actually works and getting you set up. I just want to see if there's any questions here that I need to answer before we continue. Okay, I see there's quite a few here. Let me just quickly get to the top. Okay, I see we've got a lot of project one queries, guys. I hope you're paying attention. Okay, so there's a question here. Should we start by hosting our project, our database, or do we start project 2 by using a local database? So it's up to you. If you first want to understand the concepts and get it working, you can use the local database. If you haven't started with a local database yet, I would suggest just going straight to the cloud database because you are running out of time. So please keep that in mind when you make the decision about which to use. If you connect up to a local database, you're most likely going to have to reconnect to the cloud database when you're done as well. Okay, I see there's a lot of questions about portfolio of evidence. Question 1. Can everybody still see my screen? I see there's people here saying that they can't see my screen. Cool. Okay, sweet. So I don't think there's many questions. I can't see any if there are about the work that we're covering now. So if there are, please just pop them into the chat. I'm going to move over now to the videos. I see there's a question here. The more resource groups we create, does it use up more credits? No. So the resource groups are free. The credits are associated to the resources that you create. So essentially the app services that you create, the API services or resources essentially, the database, the SQL Server, those all incur credits. But the grouping of them together in a resource group doesn't actually take credits up. If you can't see my screen and you're on your mobile, please see if you can change the settings. If you are on the PC and you still can't see, please try leave and rejoin. I'm not sure why you aren't seeing my screen. It's definitely showing. Okay, cool. So let's check how we get set up in Azure. So I've provided the link to portal.azure.com where you need to sign in using your Microsoft, your Northwest University Microsoft account. So don't use the Staff 365 or Student 365 MS Fed account. Use your student number at nwu.ac.za. Do your single sign in. It should take you to the portal essentially where you can then access your front page, which allows you then to create the student or at least utilize the student credits. So now that we've logged in, we go straight to the portal and you'll see here that there are a few different options to actually create the subscription. So it's prompting you now to create a subscription because we don't have one. So you can start either with the free Azure trial or you can go to access student benefits. So essentially you want to go to the student benefits option and you want to go claim your Azure credit now. So you click on the claim Azure credit now button and then you can essentially see here, this is what the offering is for students who are working with Azure. So there's quite a few things you can create on the subscription, as you can see here. App service is one of them. That's what we need. So you can start free. It should not require a credit card unless you've claimed the credits before. Then you might just need to attach a credit card. If you are prompted to use a credit card, please make sure you set up your budgets correctly. We're going to go through budgets after these videos to show you what you can do and how you can set it up to make sure that your credit card doesn't get charged. Please, I'm going to confirm or kind of repeat that again. Only if you have already used your student subscription or if you're using a trial will you be prompted for the credit card. If you set up your budgets correctly, you won't get charged. If you don't set up your budgets correctly and you don't use the free versions of all the resources that we're going to use, you're going to get charged. So please, please, please make sure that you are aware of all of that. It's going to get difficult if you don't manage your costing of your resources correctly, because by the time that you get to project 3, you might have already used all of your credits. And then there's not much we can do for you. All right, so once you've now created your subscription, you should essentially be seeing the Education Hub, which is now essentially the prompt that you have to now actually start creating resource groups and so on. So if we look at what creating a resource group looks like, we're still on our Education Hub, so we can now move over to our main portal, which will essentially now allow us to see what services we have. So these are all the services that you can essentially use. What we want to do is create a resource group. So up at the top, we searched for resource group, and now we're going to prompt the creation of a resource group. So what happens is you select the subscription that you want to use, you give your resource group a name. It has to be unique. If it's not unique, it'll prompt you for a different resource group or resource group name. It needs to be unique within your subscription or the subscriptions you have access to. Then the region that you hosted on is South Africa North, because it means you'll get less latency because we have a data center here in South Africa, in Johannesburg. I think we have one in Cape Town as well, but there's a lot of stuff that isn't available on the Cape Town data center just yet. So now we have the resource group. It's prompted us. It said that we've created it. So we can go into it now. We can see some of the essentially properties around it. So if you want to add collaborators, which you'll need to do for Prof. Kutsia and I, you'll need to go to access control, which is this AIM over here, and you need to add us as contributors. Once you've created resources, you'll see that all of your resources pop up over here. What's really nice about a resource group is you can actually set up budgets for a resource group. So if you know that you're going to have a subscription that has, let's say, $100 on it, and you need to create 3 projects that are going to be used in Azure, you can create a resource group per project, and you can associate credits in terms of a budget specifically to those different resource groups. The budgets don't stop you from reaching your limit, but what it does do is it actually, you can set up alerts so that you are notified when you go over that threshold or when you're getting close to that threshold. It's important that you measure, how many credits you're using so that you can kind of stay in tune with what is still left and how much you still need to do, and essentially what that credits delegation looks like. So now we want to go create resources for a SQL server and a SQL database. So essentially what you can do is you can go into the marketplace and you can search for SQL. You can go into Azure SQL and you can hit create, where you then select SQL databases. You want to use a single database. You don't want to use Elastic Pool because it's a lot more expensive. It's already associated to the resource group that we've created. If you've got multiple resource groups, make sure that you're associated to the correct resource group. You can then give your database a name. And the problem is here that you've now created a database, but you don't actually have a server to host it on. So the way that SQL Server works is essentially, or pretty much any SQL technology, is you need a server to host your database on before you can host your database or create your database. So when you're working on your local SSMS, or if you're working on MySQL Workbench, you're essentially creating a local host, which is then your server. Your database is then hosted on that server, which can then be accessed when you're local. When you're going onto the cloud, you need to do the same thing. So for instance, if you're not going to use Azure for your database hosting, and some of you may have had experience with GearHost, it forms a very similar concept. You have to have a server first before you can actually use the database. So what we need to do now is, because we don't have a server, we need to create the server as well, which they prompt you for inside of the database creation. So we're putting down a server name, which is prefixed using the instruction, or essentially the best practices put forward by Microsoft. So ZA South Africa, AZR, which is an Azure CMPG323, which is the name of what we're using, and then the SQL Server, hosting that in South Africa North, and then essentially putting down our admin username and password. You can select AD or both SQL and AD. It does get a lot more complicated when you start to do different authentication types. It's easier to start off with just the normal SQL admin or just a normal SQL auth, and then change it later on. It does get very complex when you're using AD. So now what you want to do is you want to take a look at the way that this is being costed. This environment is going to be a development environment. It's going to be cheaper when you use a development environment, and you actually need to now configure your computation as well, because this affects your costs. So if you look there, they've already predefined Gen 5, and they do this because they like to get costs out of you. So for people who don't really know how to set things up, you do tend to run into credit issues quite quickly. And this is kind of, I think, a marketing ploy by Microsoft. I don't know for sure, but essentially, when you create a database and it automatically spins up a really expensive instance, it's not favorable. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you've now selected provisioned. You want to go into basic, and you want to actually set up the cheapest tier that you possibly can, which then is basic. Then you want to take a look at the different kinds of the backup storage and essentially the redundancy that you're looking at. This, I think for now, considering that we're using this for CMPG323, it's not massively important how you choose to distribute this. Locally will be fine. If you want to do geo-redundance, you'll learn about this if you do the AZ900 training, which I very much suggest all of you do. The AZ900 training is available on Microsoft Learn, so you can do the training that you need to do to actually go write the exam to get the AZ900 certification. AZ900 is the Azure Fundamentals. If you get that certification, it becomes a lot easier to walk into industry and say, I want a job in cloud. I kind of have the certification, and it's going to look good for you. If you get to the point where you don't want to fork out for the exam, and you kind of want to get that exam while you're working at the workplace, that's fine, but at least just do the training. So that training is available for free on Microsoft Learn. You can get the trophies and badges for that and submit that as part of your portfolio of evidence. All right, so in that training, they will cover as well what the local redundancy is, what the zone redundancy is, and what the geo redundancy is. Essentially, it's just how you distribute your database so that if a partition goes down, or if a part of your database goes down, the rest is still up and running. It's almost like a disaster recovery plan that you're kind of putting into place. So now what happens is you can actually validate and create it. Please take very careful consideration as to what your monthly cost is going to be. As you saw on this, it was $7.15 per month. If you times that by 3, which is roughly the amount of time you're going to be spending on Azure, maybe 4, you're looking at anything between $21 and $28. So that means that's the cheapest possible solution that you can get for the database. If you use a free app service, you shouldn't run out of credits by the end of this module. If you leave all of the configuration as default and you don't change anything up, when you create your Azure app service and your app service plan, you're going to see, and then if you've got the premium database, you're going to see that your credits will run out within a month. So now what you can do is once you've created that database essentially on Azure, you can go grab the SQL credentials for the SQL Server, and you can actually pass that through to SQL Server. If you run into an error message here that says it cannot connect because your context is incorrect, it's because it's trying to connect to the master DB. So you can click on options over here and then just pass through the DB name that it needs to connect to. So the name of the database you've just created in Azure, not the server, the actual database. Okay, then you've now created your database, which you've done on Azure. I would suggest not creating a database from SQL Server Management Studio. You can, but I would not suggest it because the costing is going to be ridiculous. When you create a database from Microsoft SQL Server, or Microsoft SQL Management Studio, SQL Server Management Studio, it's going to create it at that Gen 5 configuration that you saw they wanted to do on Azure. So it becomes a lot more expensive. It's a lot cheaper to do it through the Azure portal because you actually can configure the costs there. Now, once we look at the app service, you can go create an app service first in Azure and then deploy it from here, from Visual Studio, or you can create it from Visual Studio and publish it one shot through. So what happens when you want to do that is essentially you've got some form of a function. So let's say we've got a function named process Excel. You've now signed into your Visual Studio. You need to sign into Visual Studio so that it recognizes who you are, so that you can actually add your Azure connection. But essentially now you've got some function here named process Excel. In your case, this will be a full project. It'll be an API or an app. And what you can do is you can right click on the project and you can hit deploy or publish. Now what happens is it prompts you to actually sign into Azure and actually select what you want to deploy as. So here you can click Azure, you want to deploy to Azure. In this case, because this is just a function, it's only going to give you the option to deploy as a web job. What happens is a web job is created as a subsidiary of an app service. So it's essentially a function within an app service that you can deploy to and execute your code on. When you have an API or an app, it's going to give you the option to create an app service, not the web job. It is important that you pay attention to this because you're going to need to create the app service, not the web job. You use the web job whenever you have a function that you want to run. When you have an entire solution like an API or an app, you're going to want to use the app service. I got a lot of questions about that last year. Please make sure that you apply it properly. You want to use the app service. So once you've selected the app service in your case, you'll click Next. It will tell you that there are no instances available. So you'll then create the instance. If you created it on Azure previously, you'd actually see it pop up there. Now what happens is you actually need to put the name in of the app service you want to create. You want to put it onto a specific subscription inside of a specific resource group, and then you want to put it on a hosting plan. Now the hosting plan is essentially what is associated to the credits that you're going to be using. So here you want to make sure that your hosting plan is the free hosting plan that you get with app services. So what happens now is you can then change the hosting plan name. You can change the location. So in this case, it'll be South Africa North once again, just to reduce latency. And then very, very important, the size must be free. Then you can save and create. Now, when you're deploying something like this into production in the workplace inside of industry, you don't necessarily want to deploy things on the free or the development plans. This is purely just for development purposes. For the work that we're doing in CMPG, it should be okay. But Microsoft is quite strict on publishing code that is being used in production to a free or a dev plan. So make sure that you use the free plan specifically so that you don't incur so many costs that your credits run out within the first month. Okay, so this is now busy creating on Azure. It created, you've got deployment slots. So essentially you can go create your dev, QA, and prod deployment slots if you really wanted to. You can finish or publish. You'll see that everything pops up after the build was successful. And now you've actually got a published project, and you've got essentially this over here that you can now use to publish every single time that the code is now updated. So whenever you update your API service or your app, which is then project 3, you can actually just right click, say publish, it'll pop this up, and you can just publish once off. So it keeps that pub XML is essentially what keeps your publishing credentials and configuration correct. That allows for that to happen. So essentially then what happens is, I just want to show you over here, the publish is then successful. You can then go to Azure and you can see that it has now been created. So if you now check, you've got your app service and you've got your app service plan. This that we're looking at over here is App Insights. So you can actually see how much data came into your service, either as the app or the API. You can see how much data came in, you can see how much data went out, and you can see what exceptions you have. So this HTTP 5XX refers to the 500 range. So for those of you who don't know, when you're working with HTTP, you've got different ranges of status codes, or essentially statuses that depict what the success or failure rate of your HTTP call was. So 200 is good, 204 is okay with no content returned. Then we've got the 400 range. So some of the common ones are 400 bad request, 401 is unauthorized, 404 is not found. I think 403 is also, I can't remember what 403 is, but then you get the 500 range. So 500 is internal server error. So this measures then what internal server errors you had. So it's important, if you don't know what those are, go read up on them, because when you're working with the API, you're actually going to want to return some of those statuses as well. Okay, now I'm going to pause there quickly before I show you how to connect to GitHub through Visual Studios. I just want to see what questions we have here in the chat. Okay, Faith, please rewatch the recording after class. It shows where to create the resource groups. Yeah, I see we've still got people trying to figure out the .NET Core. So it's actually quite interesting, because the way that the publishing works traditionally is that if you set up a pipeline, which some of you can do, if you decide to use pipelines to kind of automate this using GitHub Actions, you're more than welcome to do that. You can do some reading on how to do that. But essentially what happens in industry is when you push your code to source control and you create pull requests to branches, you can actually set up a pipeline or GitHub action that goes and takes your code that you've now put onto that branch and automatically publishes it to Azure. So the frequency of that is kind of predetermined by the steps that would need to take place for you to get the code into the right repository or the right branch to be published automatically. So for instance, once you've developed a feature and the feature works, you can push to Azure and you can test that it works online. And that would essentially replicate what would happen in GitHub. You would create your development branch, you create your feature branches. As soon as you've developed a feature, you then merge or create a pull request up into develop. And essentially then the feature that is now being completed now lives on the develop branch as well. That branching strategy that you're implementing essentially could be implemented as a kind of a parallel or a unilateral decision of how you publish to cloud as well. My suggestion is publish often, because you never really know what happens. You might forget to do a final publish, or your publish might break just before you need to submit. So the more frequently you publish, the more you can test, the more you can understand what's going on. So that is essentially my guidance on that. Okay, then I see people are still trying to sort out the .NET EF. Guys, I'll try help you with some of these queries that you have after class. I just need to run through them one by one. I just want to cover off whatever queries you have related to cloud first. Okay, guys, so if there's no questions, I just want to see here. Possibly a stupid question, but I've never looked out for it. Is the chat included with the recording upload? Because I see that there are useful inputs being posted, but I'm listening from work, so I can't currently take notes. No, so the chat isn't part of the recording that gets uploaded, but what we can potentially do is create an extract of the chat and then send that through. The problem is each week you're going to get the entire chat history. So you're still going to need to go search for what you're looking for. And if you're going to be doing it on an extract, you might as well be doing it on Teams as well. Then you can at least follow the thread. So that's hopefully answers your question. I believe you can always scroll up in Teams itself and go read it. Yeah, that's true. Okay, guys, so I'm going to continue here. So essentially what you can also do with Visual Studios is actually connect directly to GitHub, which makes it a lot easier to host your changes and show your changes and essentially push your changes to your repository, which means that Visual Studio can then be the IDE you use pretty much for everything, for publishing and then also for keeping track of your source control. So essentially what happens is if you go into Git changes, so you can go to tools and then actually enable Git if it isn't already there. Git does need to be installed. You can click on clone repository, you can go to GitHub, you can sign in. It shows that you were successfully authed. And then essentially what you can do is select the repo that you want to use as the basis of your project. So essentially then what happens is this creates that .git file inside of your solution. And then this is then recognized as the repo that you want to use going forward. So this is now going to clone. You're going to then see all the changes that pull through from the initial commit. And then essentially this is now going to be where you create your project. So in this case, we've just got the README file here inside of the repo essentially. So now what we can do is actually update the README file. And in essence, this would be code that you would be generating or changing initially. Then what you can do is you can go to Git changes here at the bottom, or you can go to Git changes here through the toolbar up at the top, and it will open up your Git changes over here. Here you can see you've got the main branch. If you're working on the dev or the feature branch, you can essentially change that. You then select your files, right-click stage. Then what happens is your staged files then get associated to a commit message, and then you commit the staged files to your local repository. What then happens is once you've committed them to the local repository, you actually need to push to your remote repository, which is then GitHub, which you then do using the push button, which was up top here. And now when you go into GitHub, you'll see that the changes have occurred. So if you were to have multiple different branches, you'd be able to change branches over here. You could create new branches and essentially see what is happening. So what we can do now is we can create a dev branch off of what we've now done in main. And essentially now what would happen is you'll have the develop branch come in as well. You can make changes to the development branch, actually push those through. And then when you go to GitHub, you can actually see what the difference is between the develop and the main branch. So this is develop branch, and the previous one was main branch. So let me just show you that again. Main branch, change the branch to develop, and then you'll see the content changes. So that's essentially how you manage content in a very quick and easy example to show kind of what the disparity is between those. Okay, so then what I want to do is I also just want to show you what happens from a subscription perspective, or essentially in Azure when we're looking at budgets. I see there's some questions coming through here, so let me just quickly check. Should we log into Visual Studio using our students' emails to do this, or does that not really affect it? So you can log in with two different accounts. You can log in with your personal account if that's where your GitHub is connected, and you can log in with your students' account if that's where your Azure is connected. And then all you do is you switch between your profiles depending on what you want to do. Then I see here, can we use VS Code instead of VS? I would not suggest it, if you're a patron of VS Code and you've been using it for a while, go for it. But publishing things in VS Code looks very different. So it's not necessarily as simple, and there are some complications that come in with it. If you feel like you can handle the challenge, go for it. But please note that we're going to be helping with Visual Studio support. It is a lot easier to use in Visual Studio than Visual Studio Code for this kind of project. Okay, and then I see there's something about the due date. Okay, you're asking about one mouse pointer. So essentially the one is clicking around, showing you the actions. The other one is me trying to illustrate for you where things are moving, or essentially what I'm trying to explain, but sure. From now on, I will use one mouse pointer. I think it is a video she was showing. Yeah, that's exactly it. So the video that I was showing essentially was using the mouse pointer to actually execute the actions. And I was using my mouse pointer to kind of circle and show you what was being executed. Okay, cool. Then essentially when you go into Azure, you can go into subscriptions. So this is now to set up your budgets essentially and to see what your alerting looks like. So once you go into subscriptions, you can then go into your subscription name. And once again, you'll see all of the different properties and options that you can configure here. So your access control essentially is now where you can actually go add new people. So you can go check the role assignments. You can see who essentially already has access to your subscription. And what you can actually do here is you can actually add people as well. So if you wanted to add Prof. Katia and I, you'd essentially do that through here. So you'd go to members, you'd select us. So we can add Prof. Katia, we can select her, and we can make her a member. She's just a user, so she'll still be able to see everything that she needs to see, and we can actually assign her to the subscription. Now we need to associate a role, so let's quickly go get contributor. Okay, we're looking for resource group contributor or just administrator. Might be easier to find right now. Here we go, reader, review and assign, reader and data access. Okay, so essentially then you can create a role like that. We'd appreciate the contributor access so we can actually go see what's going on, so that if there's anything that you made a mistake with, we can actually go help. You can also make us co-admins, it's up to you. So then you just add us as classic administrators essentially. But then that's how you add people to your subscription. What you want to also do is you want to keep an eye on your cost analysis. So you want to make sure that you understand, what your costs are being associated to. You want to see how many you have left. And essentially, as you keep using this with different resources, you'll see, which resource group is using the most credits, what the location is, what the service name is. So essentially, you can very clearly see where your costs are being associated. You can set up cost alerts. This works slightly differently to the way that budgets do. So you can either go create an alert here, or you can go through budgets. So with budgets, you can actually set up how many credits you're supposed to use. So here you can click add. You can go give your budgets a new name. You can see what the monthly, or you can set the period to either monthly, quarterly, or annual. You can show what the creator date should be, and then you can associate your threshold, which let's say in a month you should use. If you're working in 4 months and you've got $100, then let's say you should not be using more than 20 or 25 credits in a month. So once you've set up all of this information, budgets. It's monthly, it starts here. We can probably make this 2023. We can make it December 31st. And you can say next. Then you can select the type of budget. So you can do actual, or you can do forecasted. Forecasted is really nice. You can also do actual. But then what you actually need to do is you need to set up your percentages that you essentially want to allow for. You need to set up your action groups, so on and so forth as well. So what they want you to do here is say how much of the percent, or how much of the budget should you actually be able to allocate. So let's say 25% essentially, or 100%, 50%. This is essentially what you need to go plan out now, depending on what you're going to be executing, because some of you might decide to use an API manager to practice with your project too, which I would suggest spinning down when you're done. That would then kind of affect the way that you're going to do your budgeting here. So it's going to be important for you to actually put this into your planning and go see how you create this. Go make sure you've set up your action groups and everything to actually be able to do this kind of forecasting. Okay, then when you're done and you've set up your action groups, you can hit create, and it'll essentially, you can also put your email address in here so that it actually gets sent to you as a notification. And then essentially you will be able to see what happens from a budgeting perspective monthly. Okay, then there are a few recommendations you can go through if you really wanted to. These are essentially the AI that's built on top of the subscription, or on top of Microsoft, that takes a look at how you've actually put everything together, looks at your usage, and then recommends whether you should upgrade or downgrade your plans. Everything that you put inside of a resource group will be up on resources. All of your resource groups underneath the subscription you can view as well. The same way that you set up a budget over here, you can set up a budget inside of your resource groups as well. So please just be very mindful of this. It's going to be a very important part of your training. So please make sure that you go through the training as well. Like I said, it's AZ900. It'll give you the basics that you need. It is available on MS Learn. That's going to be really useful for you to understand before you start working on the cloud. Then Prof. Katia has uploaded the database that you, or the database script essentially that you need to be able to run the database essentially either on your local or on your cloud subscription for Project 2. So please go look on the resources, under resources on Ifundi to see what that looks like. There are two different scripts, one for local, one for cloud. The reason for that is because the cloud script needs to look slightly different to the way that the local one looks, because the use master and use DB functions are deprecated or actually don't work on cloud. So you need to actually then go create the script after you've created the database and then actually use the database on cloud. Okay, one last round for any questions. Are things added on the cloud private or public? And can we change the visibility setting? You can change the visibility setting. Everything on the cloud is public. Your peers, your students that are in class with you can't see what you've published though, because they don't have access to your subscription. So only when you use your subscription and you give people access to it will they be able to see what you put there. So don't stress too much about that. As long as you add us as contributors, nobody else will be able to see your work. But this cloud that we're using here is a public cloud. Okay, then trust me, don't use VS Code. It takes, there's a lot more that comes out with VS Code than with normal VS. Okay, if you run out of credits on Azure, what should I do? If you've run out of credits, you've got a problem, because then you're either going to have to run a free trial or you're going to have to figure out a way to replenish your credits. It's important that you go through these steps of setting up your alerts and your budget so that you don't run out of credits. Because if you run out of credits, there's really not much that we can do to assist you there. How do we run the script to create the database in cloud? So if you go onto SSMS, once you've logged into your database, you can actually then copy and paste the script over and actually run it there. Then it'll create all the tables for you. So the database should already be created inside of the cloud, the way that the video that I showed earlier works. And then all you need to do is create the tables, run that script to create the tables on the database. Okay, I see Carl is giving some really good advice there. 100% agree with you there. Ma'am, where can we find the SQL script needed for Project 2? As Prof. Katia said, please read the wiki and go check the resources tab on Ifundi. Okay, are there any other questions? Ma'am, for the API, do we create it on cloud or should we use VS and then put it on the cloud? The safest might be to first, connect it up in VS to your GitHub and then publish from VS, because there you can actually control your service plans and everything as well. If you do it through Azure, you're just going to have to be very careful about the way that you cast your service plan. Either is fine. I would suggest doing it from Visual Studio first. But did SQL Server Management Studio not make it more expensive? Because I remember it was mentioned it uses Gen 3 configuration. But Ruan, you make a good point. So that's why I'm saying the database itself must be created on cloud. So what happens is when you go through the Azure setup, you go create your database, you go create your SQL Server, you grab your SQL Server credentials, you go into SSMS, your studio, and you connect to the database and to the SQL Server. Inside of SQL Server Management Studio, you'll then see that your database and your server already exist there. And what you do then is you right-click on your database and you say run script or create new script or query or whatever it is. You copy the script over from what is on Ifundi, you paste it in there and you run it. The tables itself don't incur additional costs on the database. The database is what incurs the cost. So if you configure your database correctly from the portal, then you don't need to create it in SSMS because then it's already created. Okay, sweet. Then I hope that answered your question, everyone. Please shout if that wasn't clear. Okay, I only use VS. Okay, yeah. Ma'am, can you please give us until the end of the day to submit for the homework? We can discuss that and see. Prof. Katia, would you be comfortable with giving or making the deadline end of day?
Yeah, no problem. You can make it, let's say 5 o'clock today.
Perfect. Okay, so the homework from last week, the deadline for that is 5 o'clock this afternoon. Perfect. Any other questions? Okay, what are solutions to fix project not found error message when using .NET EF context. I tried using solutions in the chat, but I'm also doing something wrong. Okay, so if you're seeing project not found, it's probably because you're in the wrong directory. So what you want to do is you want to be in the same directory as your SLN file. If you hit dir and send that command through, you should be seeing a bunch of files. If you're seeing a bunch of files, then go into your file that is named the same as your solution, and then you should see your .sln, your solution file. As soon as you see your solution file, then you can run it and you should be able to see the project file, or at least have it built. If you're still getting the project not found error, then please message me one side and we can see how we can fix that for you. Keruan says the homework assignment due times are always before the class, right? It's just the one that will be, yes, that is correct. So it's only today's one that we're extending to 5 p.m. All the others are before class. Okay, guys, any other questions? Perfect. Okay, and then Prof. Couture, if there's nothing else from your side, I think we can close. Is there anything you'd like to add, Prof?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, everyone, I hope you have a lovely day further. I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah, sorry, perhaps we could just mention that people should not be working on their GitHub project until we finish marking, you know, so that we shouldn't change anything there until you get your marks.
Perfect. Thank you, Prof. I think that was a question in the chat as well, so thank you for clarifying that. Okay, thank you, everybody. Have a lovely one further.